My name's Joe Frank. I'm with the City of Fort Collins. I'm the Director of Social Sustainability. This is an important process we're going through to help focus the city's efforts and the community's efforts on what really are the important needs of the community and what can the city and the community be doing to help fill those gaps. Tonight's presentation is a lot of information that is helping us frame those questions. And then the second part of the process is going to be development of a strategic plan for the city, which will lay out what is the city's role and what should we be doing over the next 5 to 10 years. And I'm hoping at the end of that we'll have a very clear work program for my department also and for the city organization. We're looking, this is the first step in the public outreach process for this project. And this one is oriented toward boards and commissions and city staff. And there are a few others that also hear from, I know the Downtown Development Authority brought a representative, and a few other organizations wanted to attend, and they were certainly welcome. We're looking for your input tonight, and we've got a great presentation. Then we'll have some table exercises, and then at the end we'll have a reporting out, and then the next public event will be a public event, and it'll be on December 2nd at the 215 Community Room from 6 to 8 p.m. And will be invitations, and that event will be going out here very soon. What our process is to take the input from this meeting and from the public event and any other that we have, and we're going to put that into the draft final report that will be available for public review on approximately that week of December 2nd, by the end of that week, December 5th or 6th. It should be available. It'll be posted on our website, and you can download it, or you can come in and get copies from in our office too. So this is a really important meeting, an important process, looking at where we are today in terms of a number of social sustainability issues and where do we want to be in the future. And you're here this evening to help craft that future. So thank you. We are asking the boards and commissions to take what you learned tonight in the PowerPoint presentations back to your boards, and I'm thinking that probably your boards will want to chime in a little bit more than just tonight, and you'll have that opportunity. The final report will be available that first week in December, and then the next and then after the December 2nd, the next major step is there's going to be a council work session, and we're going to be sharing that information. And I know that the council would appreciate the input from the boards and commissions also. And if you have that, it'd be really helpful to send it to me so we can incorporate that into the work session on January 14th. So at that point, I'll turn it over to Heidi for the presentation.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for being here tonight. We're going to do 4 things this evening. I'm going to start by describing very briefly the purpose of our study and the focus areas, which are what we're calling the big boards that you see around the room. Then I'll talk about the primary findings by focus areas. You're going to see a lot of data and a lot of information presented tonight. I'm not going to go through every single number, so you're probably breathing a bit of a sigh of relief, but I'm going to give you an idea of what information is contained in our report, which you'll see in a few weeks, as well as what you see on these summary boards. And that'll give you, hopefully pique your interest in the topics that you'd like to spend some time with this evening. We'll have a small group exercise, as Joe mentioned. We're going to take about 20 minutes at each focus area and invite you to discuss the data that you see, what you feel like is most interesting, where you feel like you'd like some more information, what really surprised you, and where you feel like the city could be intervening into that focus area to help create a more sustainable Fort Collins. Finally, we'll report back top findings. I'll take some questions. Hopefully we can provide some answers, and then we'll wrap up. The purpose of the gaps analysis, as Joe mentioned, this is different than the strategic plan, which answers the what do we do with this information. The purpose of the gaps analysis is to identify where the city is in terms of social sustainability measures. And that begs the question of what is social sustainability? If you Google social sustainability, you'll find that there's a lot of different ideas about what social sustainability is, and there aren't a whole lot of communities like Fort Collins that are asking the question of how do we become more socially sustainable? So this is a very, very progressive effort in the United States. The way that we've defined social sustainability for this purpose is supportive services and networks that are needed by residents to achieve and maintain a quality of life and for them to achieve as much self-sufficiency as possible. These can be short-term needs. So typically we think about a safety net that people may need if something goes wrong and they need some stabilization in their lives. That's a short-term need. Some residents have long-term needs. They may have an inability to work. Quality education, I feel, is a long-term need because it spans a period of time and there are many future payoffs. The gaps may also be quantitative, so that's for those of you who don't recognize the difference between quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is numerical, so we may be able to say with a margin of error, we may be able to predict what the need is. Or qualitative, there may be a reason that people are not getting the services that they need, and it's not because they're not available in numbers, but because they're not available in the quality or the depth of service they need. Question that comes to mind when we're thinking about the gaps, or what creates the gaps? Why do we have gaps in Fort Collins? And there's a lot of different reasons. Many of those for housing, for example, are caused by market pressures. So there may not be enough supply of housing for the people who need it, especially when you're a community like Fort Collins and a lot of people want to live here. That raises prices. There may be economic challenges that cause gaps. So cuts in funding, the best example I can give, certainly something that's very familiar right now. Those budget cuts for service providers prevent them from being able to serve as many people as they may want or deliver the service quality that they'd like. And finally, demographics. Certain people have a type of need, and it becomes more pronounced as they age typically, and that also affects your demographics change. That's going to affect what kind of gaps you have in your community. We looked at these focus areas, and you'll see the boards reflect these different areas: housing, homelessness, poverty, health and wellness, education, and at-risk youth are grouped together, and diversity and equity, which includes racial and ethnic diversity, religious diversity, and sexual orientation diversity. We also looked at several specific populations because these populations in most communities have more difficult accessing housing and services and may need public supports more than other types of populations. Those targeted populations included persons with disabilities, all types of disabilities: physical, developmental, intellectual, cognitive, seniors, veterans. Veterans' needs are most addressed in our section on homelessness, victims of domestic violence, GLBT populations. These groups are addressed in the diversity and equity section, and at-risk youth, which I mentioned earlier, is covered under education. I'm going to walk through very briefly some of the information that is in the boards that appear around the room, and then I'll talk with you a little bit about what we'd like from you in terms of input and reaction to these boards. I'm not going to go through every piece of data, but just summarize what the top findings are. When BBC looks at housing need, we do something called a gaps analysis, where we look at the supply and demand of housing and where those two do not line up. We take households by income range, we match them up, in this case with a number and an affordability of rental units in the community, and we see where there's a mismatch. In Fort Collins, our estimated mismatch right here in the center under rentals is about 8,800 units. So there are 8,800 households who are living in homes, rental units that they cannot afford. They're paying more for their unit than we would like them to be. And the breakdown here shows you by income level where those people fall into income ranges. Now, some of these individuals are students, and we believe, based on estimates from the number of students who live on campus, the number of students we believe live in the community, that about 4,600 of that 8,800 could be students. So the gap, maybe the non-student gap, if you can think about it that way, in terms of rentals, affordable rentals, is about more than 4,000 units. We think about home ownership. We ask two questions. How difficult is it for renters to be able to buy? And then how many homeowners are cost burden? Cost burden means you're paying more than 30% of your monthly income, gross income, towards housing costs. And those numbers there, up in the home ownership graphic, 69% of your cost burden households earn less than $50,000 a year. So it's a struggle to be a homeowner in this community if you earn less than $50,000 a year. You can see with some of the graphics here, I'll let you peruse those at your leisure, how much of price increases the community's experienced in the last 10 years. And basically, both rental housing and homeownership housing have gone up at about similar rates, similar proportions, but homeowners, their incomes have also gone up during that time period, but renters' incomes have not. So the purchasing power for renters has declined pretty dramatically over the last 10 years. Let's talk a little bit about homelessness. Your homeless population, as the homeless populations do in every community, ranges quite a bit. Typically, people who are homeless, homeless populations are quite fluid, so people may move in and out of homelessness as their circumstances change. They may be temporarily homeless. Some people are chronically homeless, meaning that they experience episodes of homelessness for 3 years or more. So we believe your homeless range, based on the counts and surveys that have been done in your community, are 250 to 500 people. We look at data produced by the Poudre School District. At any school year, we believe that about 1,000 students may be homeless. That's not at any point in time, but falling in and out of homelessness. And then these graphics here give you some information about the characteristics of the homeless based on surveys that have been done in the community. Really good piece of news in Fort Collins is that you have a very nice coordinated one-stop shop, if you will, for people to come and get services. But there are certainly still gaps in the community and people who are unsheltered and remain unsheltered, especially during cold evenings. Persons living in poverty. This is less of a gaps analysis than a presentation of information about people living in poverty. We predict there are about 27,000 people in Fort Collins who live in poverty. Some of those individuals are students, and they don't have long-term needs, like a family living in poverty, for example, but they may have a short-term experience of poverty while they're students and not earning a lot of money. You see that manifest in the difference between the two proportions there on the right, that the 27,000 equals 19% of your population, but when we look at families only, about 9% of your families are poor. We ask the question of who are those residents by age who are living in poverty? 4,000 are children. So 14% of your population living in poverty are children. 56% are in that college student age range. So there is a significant portion of individuals who are poor, who are probably temporarily poor. 27% of the four, pretty good proportion, are of working age, so between the ages of 25 to 64. And your senior population is pretty small when we look at the proportion of seniors who are poor, as well as the proportion of seniors who make up your population in poverty. It's a pretty low number. Health and wellness. We looked at many, many facets of health and wellness, from physical health to mental health to wellness in general, access to food, for example, and we've got a lot of information. This is really just the top pieces that we felt like represented the most severe needs. Fort Collins has a higher rate of suicide than the state of Colorado. The rate is reported in the number of a rate by 100,000 people. So the rate in Fort Collins is per 100,000 residents, is 22.5 per 100,000 residents. A pretty significant portion of your children are considered overweight or obese, and that trend has been growing pretty dramatically in the last few years. There are about 8,200 food insecure households in Fort Collins, and 34 of them are very insecure. We looked at mental health treatment, the number of individuals and children, adolescents who we feel like are getting services or not getting services. That's the untreated population. And those range pretty dramatically. You can see there are about estimated 3,200 children who are untreated and who have mental health issues, 2,700 untreated adults. Substance abuse numbers are quite large. An estimated 26,000 Fort Collins residents abuse alcohol, 11,000 abuse drugs. At-risk youth and education, again, a lot of information here, and I'll just hit the high points. Children living in poverty, we looked at that number just a moment ago, but about 4,000 children live in poverty. The majority of those are 5 to 19 years old. Over the last 10 years, you've seen a bit of a shift from young children being the primary population of children in poverty, 0 to 5, to this slightly older group of children who are living in poverty. About 1,500 students in the school district are suspended or expelled. 3,200, we believe, have untreated mental illness. The numbers here on the right are the number of students who scored, who didn't receive a proficient scoring in the state standardized tests by math, reading, and writing. Pretty significant numbers there. Down here in what does Fort Collins have for child care subsidies and ECE programs, we took a look at who we thought would be eligible for child care subsidies and is not getting them, or who would take advantage of preschool if there was a subsidized program available. That ranges from 200 to 800. Diversity and equity. This section's a little more like poverty in that we're reporting back to you diversity and equity in the community and resources. We have a couple of statistics here that you may not have seen. You're probably pretty familiar with racial and ethnic diversity in Fort Collins. To summarize, the city is not terribly diverse. It's changing, as many communities are, but there's certainly a lot of resources for people who are not non-Hispanic white, which is absolutely your predominant population. We are able to get data from the FBI on hate crimes in the communities. Hate crimes are crimes that are motivated by how somebody looks, their sexual orientation, and these come from police departments but are reported to the FBI. Unfortunately, hate crimes do occur in Fort Collins, and in 2011 there were 6 incidences of hate crimes in Fort Collins. Persons with disabilities, a very large population to talk about, a lot of different types of disabilities in any community. Again, the top findings, about 10,000 residents in Fort Collins have one or more disability. 4% are children, 50% are in the adult age range, and 40% are seniors. Many seniors have a disability. Your likelihood of getting a disability increases very, very rapidly, especially after you turn 75. The median earnings for people with disabilities, in general, the median earnings in the community is lower than what you might see in a metropolitan area like Denver. Your access to jobs is certainly tighter. But people with disabilities have very, very high rates of unemployment. Many are not in the labor force because they cannot work, and many cannot find jobs. In some cases, they're competing with students for entry-level jobs, and they have extra challenges in trying to get to those jobs using public transit, finding those jobs, and so it creates a pretty difficult situation for them to remain employed. The average Social Security amount received by a person who's disabled in 2013 is only about $13,500 a year, so very hard to afford housing, especially in a high-cost community. We did some estimates here, tried to get some information on the number of accessible units that are needed. So we're talking about units for people who are physically disabled, maybe cognitively disabled, and need special adaptations for their home. We don't have good data on the wait list, the sizes of wait lists for accessible housing, but we estimate that about 200 units are needed for people with disabilities, and those would be accessible and non-accessible. Those are just affordable units, and about 60 units with accessibility and improvements could be filled up pretty rapidly if they were available. Jobs for persons with disabilities who are unemployed, we believe about 1,000 residents would like to have a job but cannot find one, and these are people who are disabled. Victims of domestic violence. The way that the CDC refers to victims of domestic violence is it's called IPV, intimate partner violence. So these statistics, many of these come out of the CDC. We took the estimates of the people who experience domestic violence based on the state average and state prevalence rates and applied that to Fort Collins. So we have two types of statistics here, people who have ever experienced domestic violence in their life and people who have experienced domestic violence in the last 12 months. Certainly growing knowledge about the number of men who experience domestic violence. That data is being reported more frequently and the data sources are getting more robust. 3,600 women in Fort Collins experienced domestic violence in the last year, 2,900 men. We look at long-term health effects of domestic violence. They can range from mental illness to physical illnesses over lifetimes. 5,800 women in Fort Collins, we believe, have experienced long-term effects of having experienced domestic violence. It's unclear how many men. We don't have prevalence rates for men. Seniors. We also looked at seniors as part of our targeted population of about 12,500 seniors in Fort Collins. 40% of them live alone. 225 are the primary caregivers of their grandchildren. So the parents are not in the household or the parents are not able to care for the children and they have found themselves in a situation where they're caring for their grandchildren. One of the interesting effects of that is when challenged with affordable housing when they're living in housing that only accommodates seniors, they can find themselves in a very compromised housing situation or potentially homeless because they're living in a facility that doesn't accept children. They get their grandchildren and then they don't have anywhere to go. So this is certainly a problem that's growing nationwide and that is present in Fort Collins as well. We have here on the right side, or my right, the different types of disabilities that seniors experience. And again, the prevalence of disability within the senior community is quite high, particularly older seniors, so seniors who are age 75 and older. Hearing is the most common type of disability, followed by ambulatory, so the physical limitations. Independent living facilities, so needing a home health care aid, and then cognitive. In sum, if I could really briefly summarize the top needs, not only what we found in the data, but what people told us. We did a lot of interviews. We've talked to a lot of service providers over the last couple months in your communities. I would definitely say affordable housing and rental housing, affordable rental housing, and a wide range of housing came up, very, very common across focus areas as a need. Transportation, so inability of people, particularly public transit and don't have, because of their disability or their income, a vehicle alternative. It's difficult to keep a job when you can't get home because the transit doesn't run after 6 p.m. Or the lack of transit on Sundays also affects their ability to work, as well as their ability to be part of the community, to go to a church, for example, or participate in a community activity. I mentioned a wide range of housing needs, and that ranges from affordable rentals to units that accommodate the different types of homelessness, emergency shelters, transitional housing, so a place for people to live for a few years while their lives stabilize, as well as permanent affordable housing. Employment is the third need. So I talked about housing, transportation, and certainly employment, not only for people with disabilities, but for the working poor. A good proportion of your persons living in poverty are employed. We saw that a good proportion of people who are homeless are employed. So lack of jobs that pay a living wage is another top need. Finally, I would like to note on serious mental illness. We look at the suicide rate, the number of people who have untreated mental illness and would like access to care. We included this as a top need, mostly around short-term intervention as well as long-term and deep quality services so that people can get fast access to care when they need it and then also be supported over time. So now it's time for your input. What we'd like you to do is pick 3 focus areas, and those focus areas should be areas that you professionally or personally have some experience with, areas that really intrigue you, that you want to know more about, but we're going to be asking you for comments, so it would be great if you had a little bit of experience with some of the issues covered in the focus areas, either through your personal experience, through clients, through your professional life. So please choose an area that you know a little bit about or that you're really, really excited about and you want to contribute. We're going to ask you what the kind of your top of mind thoughts were when you spend some time looking at the boards first, after you've had some time to process this information, what surprised you, what you expected to see and you didn't. Really most important for the strategic plan is do you have any ideas for what the city could do to address some of the gaps, or are there best practices in other communities that you've seen that you'd like to mention and recommend to Fort Collins? The facilitators are going to report back up here our primary findings, so commonalities among all of the discussions. Hi everyone, I'm going to talk about the targeted populations. So my group focused on the needs of seniors, on the needs of people with disability, and the needs of victims of domestic violence. When I asked the question, what did you learn or what surprised you, the greatest consensus or the most commonly offered statements were the number of seniors seemed kind of low. The number of seniors caring for their grandchildren seemed particularly low. So people questioned, where did that number come from? How did you calculate that? The number of men experiencing domestic violence was a surprise to many people, not only the level of it, but that they hadn't really thought about that as being a need in the community. And then a gap, somebody identified a gap in home health care provision, that it does exist now for seniors in particular, but also for people with disabilities, and it's certainly going to grow as the senior population grows. When we discussed what are the top needs in the area, we discussed that across populations and agreed that many of these needs do cross all 3 of the targeted populations. Visitable and accessible housing, not only for people who have a disability today, but are likely to become disabled as they age. Sidewalks, the lack of being able to walk predictably around the community, including CSU, poorly designed sidewalks, lack of information about access to the grocery store, to a coffee shop, just difficulty in getting around if you can't drive and you're relying on transportation, or if you are moving in a wheelchair and have to navigate, especially the sidewalks in the older part of town. The other top need that was mentioned across populations was general advocacy about population needs. Many people said, wow, I'd never really thought about this population or that population, and the community in general needs to become more aware of the needs in Fort Collins. I mentioned the question of, is there anything that you disagree with? I mentioned the small number of grandparents caring for grandchildren. That number seemed low to many people. And people also wanted some more information about elder abuse or elders who have been financially exploited. How big of a problem is that in their community? And they didn't see that on the sheet. When asked, do you have any ideas for how the city could address these needs, the common themes were increasing community awareness, increasing knowledge about resources, having opportunities for organizations to cross-pollinate, as well as raising awareness within the community among residents. And also more information, I mentioned this earlier, about just how to move across throughout the community, particularly if you're relying on public transit with the limited schedule and limited locations, the difficulty trying to get to an area outside of Fort Collins if you're on public transit, and then if you're a person with a disability, having trouble just navigating the area in the city as well. They'd love to see the city dedicating more resources to solving some of those primary problems.
We'll see if I can read my notes. So I had the health and wellness table, and some of the surprising facts with our group were the high levels of childhood obesity compared to adult obesity. People were pretty surprised that the trends are not consistent across age groups. Suicide rates, everyone seemed aware that they were high, but the continued high levels, despite decades worth of efforts to reduce those suicide levels, has been a concern. One of the more shocking reactions was the indicator related to fast food consumption among youth. So that's another surprising fact. There's some disagreement or some question about the substance abuse numbers, given that we have a high student population as well as a reputation for being a brewery type of community. So just some more information needed to understand the substance abuse rates in the community. In terms of top needs, a bunch of different topics that really touched on some of the other topics in the room. One of them being supportive housing and more detox centers for people with substance abuse issues. Continued coordination with the many service providers in the health and wellness arena. Recreation facilities as well as bike trails, sidewalks, as well as transit to recreation facilities, schools, and other community destinations, and also to healthy food outlets. And let's see. And lastly, top need includes more education. So being proactive about making sure people know how to access healthy foods, how to cook healthy foods, how to integrate them throughout their diet. In terms of ideas about how the city could potentially help fill some of these gaps, a lot of really great ideas here. From taking leadership on legislative issues and serving as a leader in funding and sustaining funding for some of the programs that are currently running, but are looking at expiration of some of their grant funding. So if the city could help sustain that grant program in the future. Let's see, what else? I mentioned education already. Scholarships for some of the existing recreation programs. Currently, the city already provides recreation scholarships, but sustaining or even enhancing some of those to get more recreation activity. Transit, I mentioned. What else? And just more comprehensive geographic distribution of recreation facilities is the last one. So, thanks.
Okay, my area was diversity and equity. And one of the first comments that most people had were, why don't we have more data? So we would like to see more things to talk about. One of the what did you learn and what surprised you was the number of evangelical Protestants in this community and the low number of Catholics. And so we're trying to figure out, did the Catholics all become Protestants? Because that just seems kind of strange with such a high number of Spanish or Hispanic people in our community. So that was just something of interest. The other thing that everybody seemed to talk about was the number of hate crimes in our community that was noted. There were 6 of them. Some thought that was low, some thought that was high. So I thought that was interesting. And they think maybe things aren't really getting reported as they really happen, so maybe that's an issue there. And then they would like to see how that compares to other crimes in the city too. Is there anything that you disagree with? And one of the things was not enough about the other religions. What about the Muslims? What about the Buddhists in our community? That kind of thing. So they would like to see even more, it broken out even more. Not enough data presented about Korea. I mean, there's like a Church of Korea and that kind of stuff. So they can't really tell what the needs are by the information presented because they didn't feel like it was enough data, really. So what do you think the top needs in the area are? To provide better demographics, have the city provide better demographics, help undocumented people maneuver the system, get the help that they need, cross-pollinate between boards and commissions better so that maybe have different groups go and talk to different groups, around the city. Understanding the diversity, ethnicity, by communicating the differences and the similarities, because even though there are some differences among us, there are also some things that we have in common, and so that would be nice to bring that together too. Invite people to participate more. People who don't participate very much in the community, try and reach out to them and to participate more. Another interesting thing that I thought came up was try to get the businesses in the community to work around the ethnicity, diversity type stuff. I know a lot of them have diversity training, and so they read the stuff, they take the test, and that they're good for a year. They don't have to do it again. So try to get them to actually integrate it into their businesses. And then the last category was good outreach, especially, with the international students, to educate them about how we do things in our community, and then also try to find out what they offer to us, because we certainly can learn from people from different communities too, different international areas. They'd also like to see us provide diversity training, ethnic training, cultural training, all that kind of stuff. So that's what it seems like the theme is, more, training, education, that kind of stuff. That's all I have.
Hi. So my group was homelessness. And I think when it comes to what did you learn or what surprised you, the biggest surprise probably was, boy, that number seems really, really low. And I think that's spot on, and it's certainly what we hear from providers. And so I think the lesson there is that each year when you do the point-in-time survey, that's not the end-all, be-all. Some other kind of things, not necessarily that people disagree with, but just things that they were seeing that wasn't up on the board, that maybe in the summers, downtown you're seeing a younger homeless population, maybe 15 to early 20s, some of those traveling with their own kids who stay for the summer and then move on somewhere else. Fort Collins also has a lot of kind of seasonal, really true transients passing through, and how do you deal with them, because they certainly don't appear in our numbers. And then the sense that there really isn't a fully functioning one-stop center or area just yet. There's more work that needs to be done, more coordination among providers, addition of different services, and maybe even raising the profile of the one-stop that you're trying to create at the Murphy Center, and a sense of a need for increased accountability among both service providers but also people receiving services. Can the nonprofits collaborate on HMIS data, or can they collaborate on tracking? We're providing services and that costs money to these people. Are we seeing any improvements? Are they on a path to success? With respect to top needs, mental health supports was, definitely a big issue, and really addressing the idea of homelessness proactively. What do we do about the chronically homeless? Should that be where we're putting all of our resources? At some point, do you just stop providing resources to some people? And the idea of trying to invest in people who want help, and that the community needs more transitional housing. And everyone was pretty well aware of the red tail that's coming online. I think that's a great idea and probably need more of it. In terms of what the city could do, thoughts were more money for prevention assistance, because that seems to work really well, and for those people who are having that episodic homelessness versus more chronic. Raising the profile of who are the homeless in our community, not just the chronically homeless that may be the most visible, but those hidden homeless who are couch surfing, those 1,100 school kids and their families. And then to the city, well, does that mean, can we think about allowing in the zoning really small houses? Or can we think about thinking proactively about the 3 unrelated rule? And we understand what that means for student populations, but what does it mean for 2 or 3 families trying to live together so that they can be housed? The idea of mentoring, needing a local detox facility, and then help with the homeless court, and a mental health court's being developed, and the city should be a partner in that. And the last bit was help with NIMBYism when someone wants to build something like Red Tail or wants to provide services, for the city to take a leadership role on that.
Okay, our area was poverty, and this one was a little bit different because we were examining data more than anything else. Things that surprised people was that the poverty rate for seniors was lower than expected, and they thought that college would help more. 73% of people in poverty had some college, and it really didn't seem to make a difference if you had finished college or had some college. It was 36 and 37%, so real similar. We disagreed, or there was a consensus about the college information is confusing, that the college information seems to skew the poverty information, so it'd be nice to show that in a couple of different ways, so that we were really looking at population demographics with and without the college-age students. Also, the poverty rate is just the wrong standard. The federal poverty rate is ridiculously low, and lots of people that make more than the poverty rate are still living in abject poverty. So some kind of recognition of that would be helpful. Also, disabled numbers and senior numbers just seemed so low as to maybe be wrong, and that could be because we're using that poverty standard. What are the top areas of needs? Emergency services need to be expanded support in all areas: housing, childcare, social support like circles and social capital building supports. Transportation limitations need to be addressed so that people can get to work. We want to build careers, not jobs. We need vocational training as well as regular other programs. But also supports for people once they have a job to build their careers. Housing needs to be affordable to all situations, and single-parent families really need more support to stabilize their children's lives so that they can break the cycle of poverty. Ideas for the city would be to use a tiered support instead of the cliff effect. And by that we mean, instead of having a cliff effect where if you get a raise you lose all your benefits, maybe your benefits would step down as your income stepped up. And so we would be helping people achieve self-sufficiency instead of making it more difficult. Better housing efficiencies could be required in rental housing. I guess Boulder does that. And the tiered support actually is an idea that is being used in Austin, Texas as well. We thought we could target economic development incentives to businesses who do some of this, do more. They invest in career building, they have social enterprise, they pay well, or they give good benefits. So target our economic development to those employers who are really making the contribution to get people out of poverty. And then the last thing we thought about was the city could help subsidize emergency assistance to provide more assistance, like more often. Very often, emergency assistance is one time per year for families, and that simply isn't enough for all situations.
I'm Molly, and my group was the housing group, which you've already heard a lot about through all of the other groups, because as was one of our major observations, is that housing is a common thread to all of these issues. And so we had a lot of really good comments that I'm not going to be able to share all of them because it does cover so much of sort of everything that we've talked about. But I'll hit some of the high points. So one of the things that was not necessarily surprising, but that was a very common reflection from the data was that there's just not enough. There's not enough housing, and that it really is an issue for a lot of different groups and at a lot of even different income levels. Another sort of common question that really came out of it was how do we really deal with the student population, and that we don't want to completely remove them from the gap because there are students who are in need, and there are students who are maybe non-traditional students who are single parents and are trying to go back to school, but then there also are a lot of students that we don't necessarily care about quite as much as far as subsidized housing and that sort of thing. So that was just something that was sort of brought up as a question. A couple of things that really seem surprising or that maybe are not reflected well in our data are that the home ownership cost burden rate seem really low to a lot of people, and that it seems like there's probably more than about a quarter that are cost burden. Also, in general, it seems like the gap is a little bit low, that there may be a lot more families in need than we are really picking up, which is not super surprising to us as well. We did hear that from a lot of providers as well. And then the other thing is that it looks like in our data that the owner income sort of kept up with housing prices, but it doesn't feel like that's true. And that's to some extent due to sort of some equity losses and that sort of thing. But in general, it feels like maybe there's more of a home ownership need than we're reflecting. And in general, it looks like maybe there's a bigger gap than we're reflecting. So summarizing that into some of the top needs, the biggest need, which is very simple, is that we need more affordable housing. And the two components of that really jumped out over and over again were workforce housing, particularly ownership opportunities for the workforce. As we talked about the working poor, there's quite a few of them, and so to be able to provide some ownership help for those looking to buy. And then rent assistance for the very low income. And also for seniors. So there's seniors that are aging in place, but then don't want to maintain their home, but can't afford to rent because the rent is so high. So that would be another sort of rental consideration. Transit came up over and over again as well, that transit does not connect people well to housing, and even where there is transit, it's focused more on access to school or sort of access to limited areas. And so to be able to really incorporate housing and transit in ways that connects people to medical services, other services, retail, grocery stores, that kind of thing was a big need. Transitional and supportive housing, as Jen talked about, also came up in our group as a major need. And then sort of just maintaining the culture and maintaining older neighborhoods and maintaining a good mix of incomes and mixed types of housing so that it doesn't get, we don't want older homes to get torn down and then big high-rise condos that are luxury apartments, that sort of thing. Just try to maintain sort of the culture and the form of some of the older neighborhoods. So those were the biggest needs that came up. A lot of great ideas for how the city could address some of those needs. A lot of the ideas were land use oriented. So the ability to have accessory dwelling units or really small homes or like multi-generational homes, just more like unique thinking around how to design housing and how does the land use accommodate that. So that was a big topic as far as potential best practices, development incentives as well to actually develop affordable housing, and let's see, some other big programs that seem needed that could be solutions are additional home ownership programs, potentially down payment assistance or other ways to get people into on an ownership track, as well as emergency rent assistance. So it goes back to what was talked about a little bit in homelessness as well, as far as prevention, being a lot more efficient to be able to give people emergency rent and utility assistance. And then providing a clearinghouse of information about accessible housing. So that's also picked up obviously in the disabilities, but to provide sort of a one-stop place where people can find information about accessibility. So those were the big points from housing. Thanks.
My name's Heidi, and our topic area was at-risk youth with sort of in the educational framework. So what surprised folks the most was pretty much when they saw what they felt was the staggeringly high figures or percentage of homeless youth, number of kids in poverty, and then number of untreated mental illness. And in terms of anything that folks disagreed with, it wasn't so much of a disagreement as maybe a need for more data or questioning some of the data. Several folks felt that the dropout numbers were maybe a little bit low as reported, and also the number for child care subsidy need might have been on the low side compared to what folks maybe had experienced or had context with. There seemed to be a need for, in some cases, trends reporting on this particular set of data or some comparisons. That would be in terms like the number of pregnancies or number of dropouts. Is that high or low? And that might be in the main report. We didn't know in comparison to other communities, or is it less than it was, or is it more than it was? Kind of where are we headed with that? The last thing in that area was more of a need for, there was some figures reported on unsatisfactory test scores, and so there was a need for giving context, and then to that, like how does that relate to the greater population, and are there correlations between the test scores and some of the identified risk factors for youth, and are the percentages proportionately higher among special populations such as kids in poverty or kids with mental illness and their test scores. Top needs, many expressed but recurring themes are parenting classes and support mechanisms for parents, an increase in the mental health and physical health resources at schools, far too few and stretched too far between. Looking for many new ways, and there were some great suggestions on improving performance for kids. And the last one was before and after and or summer or any other insert gap here for quality, affordable childcare. Lots of great ideas. One was the National Community Schools Movement, and we've seen that somewhat expressed in the Community Life Center that is housed out at Foyana. So a component increasing sort of that partnership, access to buildings between the educational community and the rest of the community. Lots of ideas around business connections for both middle school and high school kids, not just internships, but other ways that businesses could support and actually mentor youth in other ways. A need for legislative solutions in terms of being able to go down to Denver in partnerships like PSD and the city. We did let them know that our city legislative representative is very busy, but hey, we can take that on too. We'd be happy to be a partner. One great idea as far as we do have the Healthy Homes Initiative in terms of assessing homes for risk in terms of pollutants or other things. Actually, maybe from a social sustainability standpoint that is not that intrusive, but where we would go in rather than expecting people to go out and access resources, where folks would come in and just kind of visit with folks and share resources and build some connections and relationships that way. Another one, formalizing good things that are already happening. There's a medical care provider at Lincoln who kind of gives free physicals and just sort of does that out of a volunteer basis, and maybe some formalizing some things that way that are already happening. There was a mention about a need for bike paths at every school, and that would not only accomplish this, but also would address community health. More need for adults to be in relationship on the second shift level after school, as far as even checking in on kids or just building, relationships, and doesn't have to take that much time and energy. And things that are already happening, but ways for the city to more specifically be involved, I guess, and Bob can confirm this, where Parks and Rec actually gave Poudre School District $50,000 to be able to transport kids to various cities' rec facilities, not only for tutoring, but for some fun activities and helpful enrichment activities. So great model that way. And then also giving access to the world, opening up the world to at-risk youth. And that's already happening in several areas, but one of them is the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery. Their whole new opportunities program, and they're hiring a manager for that next week, where they're really opening up the museum to people who otherwise couldn't afford it, and doing enrichment programs for people who might not otherwise have access.
The presentation from tonight will be available on fcgov.com/social sustainability. That'll be available starting tomorrow. We'll put together a summary of what you all your thoughts. That'll be on the website. It might take us a week or so to pull that together. A couple of dates to keep in mind. December 2nd, there'll be a community meeting, as Joe said, at the 215 community room. And then the full report, which is currently now going through peer review among city staff, will be available on or around December 6th. And so if you want to get the presentations or any of this material back to your boards and commissions, those are the resources you can use. Thanks again for coming out and helping.